It's 3 a.m. in Rome. You're standing before a door that, for most visitors, has remained closed for more than 400 years. Beyond it lies 53 miles of shelving, a sprawling labyrinth of documents chronicling nearly every pivotal event in Western civilization since 1198. The air is heavy with the weight of 8 centuries of secrets. Somewhere in the dim silence, a lone archivist moves with deliberate precision among towering manuscripts, guarding knowledge some would call the most dangerous in the world. This is the Vatican Secret Archives, though today they prefer the name Vatican Apostolic Archives. The rebrand in 2019 was pitched as a move toward transparency. But here's the unsettling part. Even if you met the impossible requirements to enter, passing the Vatican's intense vetting process, and somehow walked through that ancient door, you would still be barred from viewing nearly 90% of what's inside. The real question isn't just what they're hiding, but why. And why, after almost 1,000 years, the need for secrecy has only grown stronger. Before we descend deeper into this maze of forbidden knowledge, pause with me for a moment. Imagine yourself here, at the end of a long day, standing at the threshold of countless unsolved mysteries. What would you feel? A quiet awe? A pull toward the truth? Because once we begin unraveling these threads, once we connect the dots from medieval banking scandals to modern geopolitics, from papal infallibility to the silencing of science, you might start questioning not only what the Vatican has hidden, but whether the history we've been taught was shaped for a purpose. If you're willing to take that leap, to follow the evidence wherever it leads, stay with me. And if this journey challenges what you thought you knew, share it with those ready to confront the same unsettling truths. This story has been buried for centuries, but truth has a stubborn way of breaking through the dark. So, let me tell you what happened when I began asking questions about that locked door in the heart of Rome. Beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica, under the political theater of papal ceremonies, stands a building that most of Earth's 7 billion people will never enter. The Vatican's underground archives stretch through secured chambers and climate-controlled vaults, perhaps the most extensive collection of Western historical records ever gathered in one place. But here's the strange reality. Out of the 85 kilometers of documents stored here, less than 10% has ever been accessible to outside researchers. The rest? Locked away, guarded by a select few Vatican employees sworn to lifelong secrecy. This isn't simply about the slow work of cataloging centuries-old manuscripts. The pattern of what's been revealed versus what's kept hidden points to something more deliberate. Do the math. The Vatican holds around 35 million documents. With less than a tenth ever made public, our understanding of Europe's history, the evolution of Christianity, the ties between church and state, and countless turning points in human civilization is built on a carefully chosen slice of evidence. And when rare glimpses behind the curtain are granted, the results often rewrite history. When the Galileo files were partially opened in the 1980s, they showed that the Church's crackdown on scientific thought was more aggressive and long-lasting than we'd ever been told. Gradual releases of World War II records revealed financial links between the Vatican and fascist regimes, revelations that continue to reshape our understanding of its role during one of humanity's darkest chapters. Every release follows the same unsettling rhythm: years of denial, partial access under heavy restrictions, then revelations that force historians to rewrite the official story. And yet, each disclosure is just a sliver of what remains locked away, hinting that we've barely scratched the surface of a much larger iceberg of concealed truths. When Vatican archivists are pressed about this slow pace of disclosure, they always return to the same justification. Some truths, they claim, are too dangerous for the public to bear. Some knowledge, they insist, could fracture the very foundations of society if revealed too soon. But this raises a deeper, far more unsettling question. Who decides what truths humanity is ready for? There's also another possibility, one the Vatican's defenders rarely entertain. What if the real danger isn't to public stability at all, but to the Vatican itself? What if, hidden within those 53 miles of shelves, is not just a vault of dangerous revelations, but evidence of a deliberate, centuries-long deception, one so vast that its exposure would permanently change how we see the relationship between power and knowledge in the Western world? The Vatican Secret Archives were never about preserving history. They were about controlling it. And once you grasp that difference, the rest of the puzzle begins to click into place. The year 1198 was more than the start of papal record-keeping. It marked the moment when the Catholic Church began to chronicle its transformation from a purely religious institution into a temporal empire. Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most politically astute pontiff in history, laid the groundwork for what would become the Secret Archives. His motivation wasn't academic curiosity or historical preservation. It was survival. He needed a centralized, meticulously kept record to manage a vast network of political alliances, financial dealings, and territorial claims stretching across Europe and beyond. But here's where it becomes even more intriguing, not in what's there, but in what's missing. The earliest preserved collections from 1198 onward are surprisingly complete. Yet when we look further back, the Vatican has almost no authentic records from the crucial centuries between 800 and 1100 CE. Historians politely call this gap the documentary lacuna. It overlaps with some of Europe's most pivotal centuries, the height of Byzantine power, the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, the golden age of Islamic civilization in Spain, and the sudden rise of the Templar banking network. Official explanations for this missing era tend to blame Viking raids, political chaos, primitive record-keeping, or natural deterioration. But these excuses unravel quickly when you realize the Vatican has somehow preserved documents from the same era. Documents that conveniently support its territorial and theological claims. This points not to accidental loss, but to intentional removal, a systematic purging of anything that might complicate the Church's preferred version of history. The surviving records from the early 13th century tell a story of an institution already wielding power with startling sophistication. Papal letters describe financial arrangements with Venetian merchants, intelligence networks stretching from Constantinople to London, and financial instruments eerily similar to those found in modern banking. Such a complex structure doesn't appear overnight, yet the paper trail leading to its creation has been almost entirely erased. Even more disturbing are the revelations about how religious authority intertwined with political manipulation. Papal bulls and diplomatic correspondence from this period are astonishingly blunt about strategies for influencing kings, controlling the flow of information, and neutralizing threats to papal dominance. The language is clear. The much-celebrated separation between spiritual and political authority, later promoted as sacred doctrine, began as a calculated public relations maneuver, not a theological truth. Perhaps most telling of all is what these early writings reveal about the Church's relationship with knowledge itself. Mentions of dangerous books and forbidden learning appear again and again, alongside detailed plans for restricting access to certain types of information. the Index of Forbidden Books, formally established in 1559, was merely the official seal on a centuries-old practice of intellectual control. The Vatican Secret Archives, in truth, were never intended to simply store knowledge. They were designed to dictate who could access it. Every decision about which documents were preserved and which were quietly allowed to vanish was an act of historical engineering, shaping the course of European civilization for centuries. And once you see it this way, the Vatican's enduring secrecy over its holdings takes on a far more calculated meaning. The greatest secret isn't tied to any single hidden document. It's the scale and precision with which the Church has operated for centuries as a global information control system. And once you start recognizing this pattern in medieval records, you begin to spot it everywhere else. Take the autumn of 1632, when Galileo Galilei stood before the Roman Inquisition. He faced more than charges of heresy. He was confronting a machinery of intellectual suppression that had been sharpened over generations, a system that understood, with chilling clarity, how deeply cosmology and political power were intertwined. The documents surrounding Galileo's trial, selectively released by the Vatican in the 1980s, tell a far darker and more complex story than the neat, heroic version most of us were taught. The official account, repeated endlessly in schoolbooks, casts Galileo's persecution as a tragic but temporary clash between faith and science, a stubborn church, a courageous scientist, and the inevitable victory of truth over dogma. In this version, the Church eventually admitted its mistake and honored Galileo's genius, affirming the triumph of empirical reason over religious authority. It's a comforting story. It lets us believe that progress is inevitable, that truth will always outlast oppression, that knowledge naturally defeats ignorance. But the Galileo files dismantle that illusion. The newly released evidence shows that the Vatican's opposition to Galileo wasn't primarily about scripture or theological rigidity. It was about power. Accepting a heliocentric universe, with the sun at the center instead of Earth, threatened to collapse the very philosophical foundation of papal authority. If Earth was not the cosmic center, if humanity was not the focal point of divine creation, then the Church's claim to be the singular bridge between God and mankind became far harder to defend. Even more unsettling are the scattered references to other cases, scientists whose works were confiscated, whose research disappeared, whose names never reached history books. Galileo's trial became famous only because his stature made it impossible to hide completely. For every Galileo, there may have been dozens whose work was silenced without a trace. The Vatican's internal memos from this era leave no doubt about their reasoning. Uncontrolled scientific inquiry, left unchecked, would eventually erode not only religious authority, but the very hierarchy of European society. Suppressing science wasn't a tragic accident of faith. It was a deliberate survival strategy. And here's the twist. Even the documents released in the 1980s, the ones used to rehabilitate Galileo's name, are just a fragment. Archival records suggest that the majority of materials, the full Inquisition proceedings, the complete transcripts of Galileo's interrogations, remain sealed to this day. Why hide them if the Church's official story is one of eventual acceptance and enlightenment? The answer begins to emerge in what the released files don't mention: the wider, organized suppression of scientific knowledge that continued long after Galileo's death. Buried inside the accessible documents are cryptic references to something called the Congregation for the Suppression of Dangerous Knowledge, an informal but persistent Vatican operation that seems to have run from the 17th century until at least the early 20th. Its mission? Identify, obtain, and bury any scientific research deemed a threat to church authority or societal order. The scope of this operation, even from the slivers we can see, appears far larger than anything acknowledged in official church history. The Galileo trial was not a one-off. It was simply the most visible ripple in a vast, hidden system of intellectual control. And the Vatican's refusal to open the complete Galileo files hints that this system may not be entirely relegated to the past. The real question isn't whether the Church admitted error about Galileo. The real question is, what other discoveries never reached the public? What breakthroughs were stopped before they could change the world? And how can we ever be certain that our current understanding of science, of reality itself, is complete when for centuries such knowledge has been subject to unseen gatekeepers? The shadow of the Inquisition may stretch far longer than history admits. Fast forward to March 1944. As Allied forces closed in on Rome and Nazi occupation began to collapse, a series of secret meetings unfolded inside the Vatican. The attendees, senior church officials, representatives of powerful European banks, and several unnamed individuals whose identities remain redacted, even in the latest, heavily censored releases. According to the fragmentary records that have surfaced, the focus of those 1944 meetings was described as the preservation of Christian assets in the post-war era, a polite euphemism masking one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations of the 20th century. The Vatican's role during World War II has long been a flashpoint for historians. Defenders of Pope Pius XII, often referred to in official records by Latinized titles, argue that his public neutrality was a calculated move, a way to safeguard the Church's institutions and protect Catholic communities under occupation. Critics counter that this silence amounted to moral complicity, especially regarding the Holocaust. But while this moral debate has raged for decades, one dimension has remained largely overlooked: the financial side of the Vatican's wartime activities. This hidden layer became far clearer in 2019, when banking records released under the Vatican's much-publicized transparency drive quietly revealed something explosive. The Vatican had not merely maintained diplomatic ties with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. It had acted as a key financial middleman for a network that allowed senior Nazi officials to turn plundered wealth into safe, portable assets for use after the war. The method was alarmingly straightforward. Gold, art, and other valuables stolen from occupied territories, much of it taken from Jewish families, were donated to the Vatican as religious offerings. These were immediately converted into Swiss bank deposits or diversified investment portfolios. From there, the funds were quietly distributed to designated recipients through Catholic institutions scattered across South America. The Vatican Bank, formerly the Institute for the Works of Religion, founded in 1942, was purpose-built for such operations. As a sovereign entity under Vatican jurisdiction, it was exempt from the regulatory oversight and financial reporting requirements that bound other international banks. This unique legal status, combined with the Church's global institutional network and diplomatic protections, created the perfect infrastructure for moving vast sums across borders without leaving a trace. And Nazi gold was only the entry point. The 2019 disclosures show that the Vatican's wartime financial activities were part of a much older and broader system, in place since at least the early 1900s. The records include references to similar arrangements during the Spanish Civil War, deals with Italian industrialists during Mussolini's rise, and financial partnerships with Eastern European oligarchs. The evidence points to a Vatican business model that was entirely pragmatic, not bound by ideology, but by opportunity. The real shock isn't the corruption itself. It's the meticulous, decades-long deception that followed. For years after the war, Vatican officials flatly denied any significant financial involvement with fascist powers. They promoted a narrative of moral neutrality and humanitarian work, funding historical studies, sponsoring education programs, and creating charities that reinforce the image of a church above politics. Yet, behind closed doors, the very institutions that cultivated this moral image were managing portfolios built from stolen Jewish wealth, profits that were then funneled into political groups across Europe and Latin America, promoting conservative Catholic agendas. The contradiction is staggering, an institution presenting itself as the conscience of the world, while privately profiting from genocide. The documents also uncover a second, equally damning truth. The Vatican's post-war financial networks were just as sophisticated and just as morally compromised as those that operated during the war. The infamous rat lines that spirited Nazi war criminals to South America weren't purely acts of mercy to prevent reprisals. They were business ventures, generating substantial revenue for church institutions while ensuring the loyalty of men who knew too much about the Vatican's wartime dealings. Perhaps most telling, the files suggest that these wartime operations laid the groundwork for enduring patterns of covert finance and political influence. References to Project Gladio, the CIA-backed program aimed at blocking communist electoral wins in post-war Western Europe, appear throughout Vatican banking logs from the 1950s and 1960s. The implication is clear. The Vatican's financial collaboration with fascist regimes slid almost seamlessly into Cold War cooperation with American intelligence. The Vatican's public reaction to these financial revelations has been as predictable as it is familiar. Acknowledge past mistakes, insist that such actions were rare deviations, and frame them as historical anomalies rather than core institutional traits. But the financial records tell a very different story. They show an institution that has, time and again, used its unique position to move illicit wealth across borders, provide discreet financial services to dubious political movements, and operate as a sovereign bank, answerable to no outside authority. Follow the Nazi gold trail carefully, and it doesn't lead to a self-contained scandal we can file away under World War II history. It leads to an unbroken pattern of financial activity that raises profound questions about the Vatican's current dealings and its ongoing role in global financial networks. The true revelation in these wartime records isn't just what the Vatican did during the war. It's what these actions reveal about its deeper relationship with money, power, and moral authority. If the Church was willing to profit from genocide, then one must ask, what other ethical boundaries would it be willing to cross to protect its interests? For a clue, we need to look much further back to October 13th, 1307, one of the most infamous days in medieval history. Most know it as the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. On that day, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of Templars, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and occult rituals. According to the official story, this was the downfall of the order, ending with the execution of Grand Master Jacques de Molay in 1314, and the complete dismantling of the Templars' vast financial empire. But documents hidden in the Vatican Secret Archives, and only made public in the 21st century, tell a different tale. In 2001, researchers uncovered the Chinon parchment, a misfiled record buried for nearly 700 years. Released in 2007, it revealed that Pope Clement V had actually absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. the very charge used to justify their destruction. In other words, the Vatican knew the Templars were innocent, yet publicly supported King Philip's purge. And the Chinon parchment was only the beginning. Later releases revealed extensive correspondence between Vatican officials and surviving Templar networks well into the 14th and 15th centuries, suggesting the order's eradication was far from complete. More unsettling still are the financial records. They show a direct continuity between Templar banking practices and Vatican financial operations that appeared in the decades after the Templars' supposed dissolution. Before their fall, the Templars had been the most sophisticated financial power in medieval Europe. They pioneered techniques in credit transfer, secure loans, and international banking partnerships that enabled global commerce centuries ahead of their time. By the official account, all of this vanished overnight in 1312. Except it didn't. By the mid-14th century, Vatican archives show the sudden emergence of complex banking systems virtually identical to Templar methods, run by individuals with no formal roles in church hierarchy, through institutions that had no obvious connection to traditional Catholic administration. The timing is too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Within months of the Templar suppression, the Vatican had somehow acquired financial capabilities it would have taken centuries to develop independently. The continuities weren't just financial. Architectural and symbolic links persisted too. Churches built under Vatican direction in the decades after 1312 incorporated distinctly Templar elements, precise geometric layouts, symbolic iconography, and hidden chambers that served no liturgical purpose. Perhaps the most famous example is the Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by William Sinclair in the mid-15th century, adorned with Templar symbols so numerous and explicit that they defy any suggestion of accident. But the most compelling evidence for the Templars' survival is found in the Vatican's own post-Templar administrative structures. From the 14th century onward, the Church established semi-autonomous organizations, military orders, charitable trusts, and educational institutions that operated with extraordinary independence from direct papal control. They managed their own finances, maintained internal hierarchies, and followed organizational principles strikingly similar to those of the Templar order. The pattern points not to the Templars' destruction, but to their absorption into the Vatican's institutional machinery. Rather than eliminating a rival, the Church appears to have co-opted Templar expertise, folded their financial methods into its own systems, and integrated key personnel into Catholic structures, all while maintaining the public fiction that the order had been wiped out. This reading gains further weight when you map the geography of Vatican activity after 1307. Church investments, missionary ventures, and political alliances across the following centuries consistently concentrate in the very regions that were once Templar strongholds: the Mediterranean basin, the eastern trade routes, and the new commercial hubs of Northern Europe. The Vatican's sudden fluency in international commerce and banking becomes far easier to explain if we assume it inherited a functioning Templar network rather than developing one from scratch. The financial ledgers reveal something else conventional histories mostly miss. The post-Templar Vatican expansion wasn't driven solely by religion or politics. It was about controlling the emerging European economy. By absorbing the Templar financial superstructure while publicly endorsing the order's destruction, the Church eliminated a competitor even as it acquired the capabilities needed to shape European trade and politics for centuries. If the Templars weren't truly annihilated but subsumed into Vatican frameworks, then the financial and political circuits born in the medieval era may be far more continuous and influential than we've been led to believe. The Vatican's present-day financial operations, global political reach, and uncanny institutional resilience make far more sense viewed as the ongoing expression of a tradition that reaches back to the Crusades. This Templar link hints at something rarely confronted in assessments of Vatican power, that some of the Church's most zealously guarded secrets may concern financial and political arrangements maintained over centuries, not merely theological disputes or historical episodes. The secret archives may well hold documents that expose the full scope of this institutional continuity, and perhaps evidence of ongoing obligations and relationships whose roots lie in the medieval world. In that light, the disappearance of the Templars looks less like extinction and more like a masterclass in camouflage. Their core functions preserved, their forms and public identities transformed. If that's true, then to understand the modern Vatican, we must grasp not only Catholic doctrine and history, but the financial political legacy of an order officially declared dead 7 centuries ago. Jump forward to 1947, a turning point in Vatican-American relations that would reshape global politics for decades. The full extent of this shift remained buried until a run of releases beginning in 2010. Those files show how the early Cold War provided cover for an unprecedented expansion of Vatican influence inside U.S. foreign policy, well beyond customary religious diplomacy, deep into covert operations, psychological warfare, and systematic social engineering. The partnership began with a shared realization. Both the Vatican and American intelligence grasped that the struggle against communism demanded more than armies and aid. It required the shaping of public consciousness, molding cultural norms and political loyalties across entire societies. With its worldwide infrastructure and a sophisticated grasp of mass psychology, the Catholic Church was an ideal partner for U.S. operations needing global reach coupled with moral legitimacy. Operation Gladio, the clandestine NATO effort to block communist electoral victories in Western Europe, is the most thoroughly documented emblem of this alliance. Recently declassified CIA materials indicate that Vatican institutions acted as key intermediaries, channeling funds to anti-communist movements in ways that evaded official oversight, while conferring a moral imprimatur that made otherwise dubious activities appear justified. But Gladio was only the start. Documents released in 2015 point to a parallel effort, codenamed Operation Splendor, aimed specifically at American domestic politics. This program leveraged Catholic institutions inside the United States to advance candidates and policies aligned with both Vatican priorities and CIA strategic aims. A refined influence network that slipped beneath the radar of democratic oversight. Its mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. Catholic charities, schools, and media outlets received funding that originated with CIA front organizations, but was routed through Vatican financial channels to mask the true source. Those institutions then pushed political messaging that appeared grounded in religious teaching, yet was in reality crafted to serve targeted geopolitical objectives. The effectiveness becomes obvious when you scan American political discourse through the Cold War. The steady alignment between official Catholic positions and CIA goals wasn't accidental. It reflected systematic coordination between Vatican officials and U.S. intelligence operators who worked in tandem to shape public opinion across issues from labor policy to foreign affairs. Perhaps the most troubling dimension of this alliance was its open intent to manipulate democratic processes. Internal CIA memoranda from the 1950s and 1960s outlined step-by-step strategies for using Catholic networks to steer elections, mobilizing Catholic voters on cue, discrediting opposing candidates, and promoting policy planks that served intelligence objectives while appearing to be motivated by religious conviction. and the scope reached far beyond campaign tactics. Curricula in Catholic schools, programming in Catholic media. Even the themes emphasized in religious services were synchronized with CIA messaging goals. The ambition wasn't merely to tilt a race here or a bill there. It was to engineer the worldview of millions of American Catholics in ways that would buttress intelligence priorities for generations. The partnership also ran in reverse. Vatican intelligence networks, operating in various forms since the medieval era, supplied U.S. agencies with information and access unavailable through standard channels. Catholic institutions behind the Iron Curtain functioned as informal collection points, while Vatican diplomatic pathways offered unofficial conduits between American officials and foreign governments. Arguably, the most consequential legacy of this collaboration was its role in developing modern mass manipulation techniques that continue to shape American politics. Joint psychological research by Vatican and CIA operatives during the Cold War pioneered methods of social engineering that fused religious motivation with behavioral science, producing unprecedented tools for steering public opinion and political behavior. The documents describe experiments that used religious symbolism to trigger targeted emotional states, embedded political cues within devotional content, and exploited religious authority to override rational analysis of political questions. These Cold War methods map uncomfortably well onto the manipulative playbooks common in contemporary politics. The Vatican-CIA partnership also set institutional precedents that outlived the Cold War itself. Networks built in the 1950s and 1960s became the backbone for ongoing relationships between Catholic entities and American intelligence, relationships that, according to recent releases, evolved and expanded with new geopolitical challenges while preserving their essential character. Most disturbing is what these files imply about the Vatican's willingness to subordinate its religious mission to political ends. To sustain this collaboration, church officials engaged in conduct difficult to reconcile with Catholic moral teaching, deception, manipulation, and the systematic erosion of democratic processes in pursuit of institutional power. The American penetration of Vatican operations wasn't a temporary expedient of the era. It marked a fundamental reconfiguration of the Church's relationship to secular power, a shift that continues to shape both institutions today. The full extent of that transformation remains locked inside the classified portions of the Vatican Secret Archives. Yet even the partial disclosures indicate that to understand modern Vatican operations, one must understand their integration with American intelligence networks. So the question isn't whether the Vatican collaborated with U.S. intelligence during the Cold War. It's whether that collaboration ever truly ended, and what its continuation would mean for religious freedom and democratic governance in the present day. On the morning of May 13, 1917, 3 Portuguese children reported an apparition of the Virgin Mary in a field outside the village of Fatima. What began as a small local curiosity soon became one of the most politically consequential religious phenomena of the 20th century. A phenomenon that ultimately provided cover for some of the Vatican's most controversial political actions and closest-held institutional secrets. The official Fatima story, promoted by the Church and embraced by millions, recounts 3 secrets given by the Virgin to the child seers. 1. A vision of hell. 2. A prophecy about World War II and the spread of communism. 3. A vision of persecution of the Church, culminating in an attempt on a pope's life. According to Catholic teaching, these messages supplied divine guidance for navigating the spiritual and political crises of the modern age. But documents from the Vatican Apostolic Archives paint a far more intricate picture, one suggesting that the Fatima phenomenon was systematically shaped by church authorities to serve concrete political aims, while concealing information that might have redirected the course of 20th century history. The orchestration began almost immediately. Materials released in 2017 indicate that Vatican officials were coaching the child visionaries from the earliest phases, feeding them theological concepts and political language far beyond the reach of uneducated peasant children. What appeared to be a spontaneous eruption of the sacred was, in practice, a carefully staged performance, designed to cloak specific policy positions in divine authority. The most telling case is the third secret of Fatima, kept hidden for over 80 years and only partially disclosed in 2000. The official narrative presented a vision of church persecution, later interpreted as prophetically fulfilled by the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. When that version is compared with surviving testimonies preserved in archives outside Vatican control, serious discrepancies emerge. Discrepancies strongly implying substantial editing before publication. Even more troubling are references in newly released files to a fourth secret, one never intended for the public. Fragmentary mentions in papal correspondence from the 1940s and 1950s describe specific predictions about an internal collapse of church authority and the exposure of systemic corruption inside Vatican institutions. The prophecy reportedly foresaw a period when the Vatican's moral standing would be shattered by revelations of financial abuses, sexual misconduct, and political manipulation. Crucially, this secret reads less like mysticism and more like a clear-eyed risk assessment by insiders who already saw the structural vulnerabilities of the early 20th century church. Suppressing that information while amplifying the other Fatima messages served multiple strategic purposes. It sanctified certain political positions and buried accurate warnings that, if acknowledged, would have undermined Vatican authority. The Cold War deployment of Fatima makes the political utility even clearer. The second secret's focus on Russian communism offered ready-made justification for Vatican cooperation with Western intelligence, while the promise of Russia's eventual conversion supplied a religious frame for geopolitical developments that conveniently aligned with American strategy. The timing was no accident. The Fatima narrative was promoted most aggressively precisely when the Vatican needed divine cover for controversial alliances. Yet the most revealing aspect of the Fatima files isn't the apparitions themselves. It's what they expose about the Vatican's sophisticated grasp of mass psychology and political manipulation. Internal communications from the 1940s to 1950s discuss Fatima in explicitly strategic terms. Its value for mobilizing Catholic populations, discrediting communist movements, and legitimizing contentious church policies. The documents detail coordinated media blitzes, the selective amplification of interpretations that served institutional aims, and the suppression of alternative accounts that did not. Even the celebrated Miracle of the Sun, witnessed by thousands in 1917, takes on a different cast when paired with notes showing Vatican meteorologists had been tracking unusual atmospheric conditions in the area for months, and that church officials had been priming pilgrims to expect supernatural signs. Perhaps most unsettling are the references to ongoing Fatima-style operations replicated across the world throughout the 20th century. The files suggest the Vatican learned not merely to endorse, but to manufacture and manipulate religious phenomena for political ends, leveraging psychology, media management, and crowd dynamics to stage miracles that provided cover for institutional objectives. The Fatima corpus also exposes a factor consistently downplayed in standard histories: the role of intelligence services in constructing religious narratives. Repeated references to coordination between Vatican officials and multiple national intelligence agencies appear throughout the documentation, indicating that Fatima functioned not only as a tool of church policy, but as part of broader geopolitical operations reaching far beyond purely religious concerns. The shadow cast by the third secret, or more precisely, the fourth, reaches far beyond Fatima itself. It reveals an institution willing to steer religious devotion for political ends, to bury inconvenient revelations while elevating useful ones, and to stage-manage sacred narratives for millions of believers. The real secret of Fatima isn't what the Virgin Mary purportedly told 3 Portuguese children. It's what the Vatican's handling of those messages exposes about the collision of religious authority and political power in the modern era. And if the Church was prepared to manipulate one of the century's most influential religious events for political purposes, what other spiritual experiences have been manufactured, edited, or suppressed to protect institutional interests? In 1979, the Vatican unveiled what seemed like a routine scientific body, the Vatican Observatory Research Group, devoted to astronomy and peaceful exploration of the heavens. On the surface, nothing unusual. The Church has maintained observatories since the 16th century, partly to display a commitment to science, partly to fulfill calendar and timekeeping roles. But recently declassified files suggest the observatory was the public facade for a far more ambitious, tightly guarded enterprise, Project Lucifer, a comprehensive probe into phenomena that challenge the core assumptions of scientific materialism and traditional doctrine alike. The initiative began with a straightforward observation that had unsettled Vatican theologians since the early 1900s. A rising tide of paranormal reports among practicing Catholics, near-death experiences, mystical visions, encounters with the dead, meticulously recorded by church investigators. These cases displayed consistent patterns that resisted explanation by either conventional theology or mainstream science. Rather than dismissing them as mere psychology or demonic deceit, a select team of Vatican scientists and theologians launched a systematic inquiry into what they termed consciousness anomalies. Working with neuroscientists, physicists, and psychologists from leading universities, they set out to document and analyze experiences suggesting that human consciousness might operate according to as-yet unknown principles. The results, preserved in files partially declassified in 2018, proved more consequential than anyone anticipated. Carefully controlled studies of near-death experiencers revealed reliable physiological and neurological changes that current brain science could not account for. Even more provocative were cases in which subjects appeared to obtain accurate information about distant events or deceased persons through channels that defied ordinary sensory explanation. Most disturbing, however, were the findings on systematic consciousness manipulation. The archives detail extensive research into methods for inducing mystical states, shaping religious visions, and modulating spiritual belief via a triad of tools: psychological conditioning, electromagnetic field manipulation, and pharmaceutical intervention. Officially, this work was justified as a way to tell authentic spiritual experiences from fabricated ones. In practice, the applications were far broader. By the 1990s, Vatican researchers had reportedly developed sophisticated protocols to generate convincing religious experiences that could be triggered remotely and targeted to specific people or communities. Initial tests involved volunteers within church institutions. Later trials, the files suggest, were conducted on unsuspecting populations in multiple regions. The aim wasn't merely to understand religious experience, it was to control and direct it. Equally consequential were the theoretical implications. Vatican scientists claimed evidence that human consciousness operates in ways that upend materialist assumptions about reality. It may be non-local, may persist beyond bodily death, and may directly influence physical events in ways that violate accepted scientific models. This placed the researchers in an extraordinary bind. On one hand, the findings buttressed traditional teachings about the soul, the afterlife, and the supernatural. On the other, disclosing them risked destabilizing both science and religion. If consciousness survives death, if humans possess capacities that transcend the physical, if the line between the natural and the supernatural is far more porous than we're taught to believe, if these findings are true, then both scientific materialism and institutional religion would need a fundamental overhaul. The Vatican's response to this dilemma speaks volumes about the nexus of knowledge and power in our era. Instead of sharing the results with the wider scientific world or integrating them into church teaching, officials classified the research and pushed forward in secret. They held evidence that could have transformed our understanding of consciousness, death, and the nature of reality, and chose to treat it as a strategic asset, not a gift for humankind. The consciousness files point to something even more troubling. Others had reached similar conclusions on their own. References throughout the archive describe coordination with government-run consciousness programs, implying that intelligence agencies, military units, and corporate labs had uncovered the same phenomena and made the same choice to keep them hidden. The implications are staggering. If multiple institutions possess scientific evidence for non-material dimensions of mind, if they've developed techniques to manipulate spiritual experience, and if they've jointly decided to suppress this knowledge, then our entire picture of human nature and potential has been deliberately constrained to protect institutional interests. In this light, the Vatican Observatory wasn't merely studying the stars. It was charting the inner cosmos, and what it found there was apparently so consequential that it has been sealed away from the public for nearly half a century. So the urgent question isn't whether consciousness survives death or whether humans have psi-like capacities. It's why institutions holding evidence for such phenomena have opted to conceal rather than reveal. The consciousness files suggest that the Vatican, along with other powerful entities, may hold knowledge about human nature that would radically redefine our place in the universe. Yet this knowledge remains locked down, accessible only to a narrow circle of initiates, while the rest of us keep operating on assumptions that may be fatally incomplete or outright wrong. In the spring of 2017, Pope Francis announced the most ambitious transparency effort in Vatican history, a full digitization of the secret archives, promising that modern technology would finally open these historical treasures to scholars and the public. Branded as the Digital Vatican Library, the project was hailed as a revolutionary leap toward openness, a high-tech answer to centuries of accusations about Vatican secrecy. The Pope blessed the plan himself, framing it as a way to share the treasures of human knowledge with all. But as the digitization advanced, something unexpected emerged from the data. Computer scientists on the project, equipped with advanced AI systems capable of scanning vast textual corpora for patterns and correlations, began uncovering connections no human researcher had ever noticed. Free from human assumptions and blind spots, the AI highlighted patterns that pointed to a startling conclusion. The secret archives contain evidence of historical narratives that contradict almost every major assumption about how Western civilization developed. It started with a simple observation. When the AI processed the complete medieval corpus, it detected linguistic structures and conceptual frameworks, indicating far more sophisticated philosophical and scientific understanding than traditional histories credit to the Middle Ages. References to astronomical calculations, mathematical principles, and technological innovations appeared consistently in documents from eras when such knowledge was supposedly absent in Europe. And the pattern went deeper. Cross-referencing showed that manuscripts from different centuries and distant regions contained identical technical content, often expressed in strikingly similar language. Evidence of preservation and transmission networks operating across centuries and continents. The familiar tale of a dark medieval period, followed by a sudden Renaissance rediscovery, began to look like a constructed myth, designed to hide a continuous thread of advanced knowledge throughout European history. Even more disquieting were the correlations the AI surfaced between major historical events and documentary patterns. Major political turns, religious reforms, scientific leaps, and cultural waves consistently coincided with specific Vatican patterns of document creation and classification. The signal was unmistakable. Many developments we treat as spontaneous were planned, coordinated, and managed by Vatican authorities in concert with other powerful institutions. The AI surfaced something even more disquieting: systematic editing and revision of records well into the modern era. Textual forensics showed thousands of documents had been altered, with certain categories of information regularly removed or rewritten. This wasn't random housekeeping. The edits selectively erased references to alternate histories, suppressed traces of advanced ancient knowledge, and deleted evidence of joint operations between religious and secular power centers. The most consequential finding, however, concerned the digitization process itself. The algorithms detected embedded code inside the digital files, invisible to ordinary users, but legible to advanced analytic tools. Functionally, it worked as digital redaction. When accessed through normal research portals, the files would auto-hide or subtly modify predefined classes of information. In short, the digitization effort did not expand access, it refined control. Researchers were being funneled toward curated facsimiles, while the unaltered originals remained sealed behind encryption layers and algorithmic filters. The implication flips the narrative of transparency on its head. The digital Vatican Library was not a break from tradition, but the capstone of centuries of information control. Now armed with modern tooling to manage what history the public can actually see, future scholars would enjoy the illusion of total access while receiving only what had been algorithmically cleared as safe. And the story grows more tangled. The computer scientists who uncovered these patterns weren't meant to have the diagnostic capabilities that exposed them. Their AI toolchains came from external tech firms with their own interests in mining Vatican data. The digitization initiative had inadvertently created an arena where multiple actors tried to shape and exploit the same corpus, a digital Cold War waged with algorithms and keys rather than guns and spies. This digital paradox extends well beyond church archives. It demonstrates how advanced technology can simulate openness while enabling tighter, subtler information control than ever existed in the analog era. The promise of transparency can mask algorithmic manipulation, producing environments where the public believes it possesses full access while engaging only with carefully pre-selected slices. That realization carries heavy consequences for truth-seeking in a networked age. If powerful institutions can deploy AI to filter and modify content while preserving the appearance of completeness, then our traditional methods for separating truth from propaganda may no longer suffice. The Vatican's digital stacks may be merely the opening chapter of a broader epoch in which invisible control becomes the norm, and therefore more effective. In the end, the digitization project's most explosive revelation is not a single fact or sensational document. 0. It's the proof that modern technology can make censorship and manipulation more sophisticated and far harder to detect. Yes, the secret archives have been digitized, but they remain secret in ways that are subtler, deeper, and more comprehensive than ever before, than anything achievable through old-world physical gatekeeping. So the question isn't whether the Vatican has finally thrown open its archives. It's whether any institution in the digital age can truly be held to account when the technology of control races ahead of the technology of access. Morning light slips through the narrow windows of the Vatican's sealed stacks, illuminating motes that drift above manuscripts carrying 8 centuries of accumulated secrets. But as we leave these hidden corridors, we face a question that reaches far beyond Vatican walls. What does it mean to live in a world where the guardians of knowledge can determine not only what we know, but what we are capable of knowing? The archivists who inhabit these rooms, carefully preserving and selectively unveiling the papers that shape our sense of the past, occupy a singular role in human society. They are keepers of collective memory, curators of cultural inheritance, arbiters of what future generations will accept as history. Yet they are also human, formed by institutional loyalties, political constraints, and personal convictions that inevitably influence what is saved, what is hidden, and what is allowed to vanish. This human element in curation creates a paradox that extends far beyond Rome. Every archive, library, university, newsroom, every gatekeeper must decide which information to preserve, how to frame it, and when to release it. The Vatican's distinction isn't that it curates, it's the scale, sophistication, and longevity of its curation. 8 centuries to refine methods. 8 centuries to study how information shapes consciousness and behavior. 8 centuries to build systems that preserve institutional power across regimes and revolutions. Over time, they learned which kinds of knowledge truly threaten established order and which can be released to simulate transparency without disturbing the scaffolding of power. But this mastery of information control forces deeper questions about truth itself. If our understanding of history, science, and human nature has been molded by centuries of systematic filtering, if the evidence we use to make sense of the world has been sifted through interests we barely perceive, how confident can we be that our beliefs reflect reality rather than the preferences of gatekeepers? The puzzle grows more complex when we consider that the archivists themselves may not fully grasp the consequences of their choices. Their institutional knowledge is cumulative, inherited, policies passed down from contexts that no longer exist, applied to problems their authors never imagined. Today's custodians may be faithfully enforcing strategies crafted for dangers long gone, unintentionally creating new risks they cannot yet see. This points to a deeper paradox of power. Institutions that maintain control for generations can become hostages to their own success, compelled to continue obsolete tactics because abandoning them would mean admitting those tactics were needless or harmful. The Vatican's ongoing secrecy may signal not serene command, but anxiety about what openness might unleash. There is also a psychological dimension for us. the consumers of curated knowledge. We live our own version of the archivist's paradox. We demand complete and accurate information, yet we depend on authorities to filter, frame, and translate complexity into something usable. The alternative, confronting the raw, unmediated torrent of reality, can be paralyzing. Thus, a symbiosis emerges between institutional opacity and individual comfort. We insist on transparency while relying on someone else's opacity. We claim a right to know while outsourcing decisions about what we need to know. In that sense, Vatican archivists may be performing a service we both resent and require, shouldering knowledge that might be too intricate, too unsettling, or too destabilizing for broad consumption. But this bargain carries costs we are only beginning to count. If we let institutions set the boundaries of acceptable knowledge, if we accept curation without understanding the rules behind it, if we mistake managed information for complete information, we risk building a civilization on assumptions that are partial, outdated, or outright wrong. Seen this way, the secret archives are more than a vault of hidden papers. They are a test of our collective commitment to truth and of our willingness to face the full complexity of reality without constant mediation. Those locked doors do not merely guard documents. They confront us with our own relationship to knowledge and power, our tolerance for uncertainty, and our capacity to absorb information that challenges our most basic assumptions about ourselves and our world. The custodians of these secrets are not merely Vatican staff with keys to sealed rooms. They are all of us, every time we prefer comfort to inquiry, authority to independent investigation, curated stories to tangled realities. The secret archives are not only in Rome, they live in our own minds, in what we choose to learn or ignore, in the questions we dare to ask or decide to silence. The dilemma facing the keepers of Vatican secrets may be the dilemma facing humanity itself. How do we balance the human need for stable beliefs with the moral duty to seek truth? How do we preserve social cohesion while acknowledging discomforting realities? How do we protect the gains of civilization while remaining open to the possibility that some of our bedrock assumptions are wrong? As these closing lines are written, the Vatican Secret Archives continue their ancient rhythm. New items are cataloged, files are classified. Researchers apply, approved or refused by criteria that remain opaque. The archivists carry on, making choices about disclosure and concealment that will shape understanding for generations. The cycle endures, as it has for 8 centuries, and likely will for centuries more. Yet something in our relationship to secrecy has changed. The questions we've explored about power and knowledge, about truth and control, about the price of institutional stability and the cost of hidden information can no longer be dismissed as paranoia or mere academic sport. The evidence we've reviewed, much of it from the Vatican's own gradual releases, shows that institutions do manage information, do coordinate across centuries, and do hold knowledge capable of transforming public views of history, science, and human nature. This doesn't crown every conspiracy theory with truth, nor does it render all authority illegitimate. It does shift the burden of proof. Claims of transparency and accountability must be weighed against demonstrated patterns of secrecy and spin. We can no longer assume that what reaches us is the whole picture, even when it comes from sources we were taught to trust. The secret archives, in this light, force a broader question. What happens to a civilization when the gap between what institutions know and what the public knows grows too wide to bridge? What happens when citizens must make democratic choices with information that is incomplete, outdated, or deliberately shaped? What happens when centuries of accumulated secrets become too heavy for any institution to carry? There are no easy answers, but the questions demand serious attention. To keep living by potentially faulty assumptions while powerful institutions act on information we cannot access may prove unsustainable in an age when technology supercharges both information control and revelation. The Vatican's recent digitization efforts, whatever their motives or eventual effects, acknowledge that traditional methods of control no longer suffice. Even limited, tactical document releases concede that absolute secrecy is no longer politically viable. The very institution that perfected information control over 8 centuries is being forced to adapt to a world where information strains to be free and secrets are harder to hold. This ushers in a familiar but uneasy symbiosis between institutional opacity and individual psychology. We demand transparency while we lean on opacity. We insist on our right to know, even as we depend on others to decide what we need to know. In this sense, Vatican archivists may be performing a service we both resent and require, bearing knowledge that may be too complex, too disturbing, or too destabilizing for broad release. But the comfort of that arrangement carries a cost we're only beginning to tally. If we let institutions define the boundaries of acceptable knowledge, if we accept curation without understanding the principles behind it, if we mistake managed information for complete information, then we risk building a civilization on assumptions that are partial, obsolete, or entirely wrong. In this light, the Vatican Secret Archives are more than a vault of hidden papers. They are a test of our collective fidelity to truth and our willingness to face reality's complexity without institutional mediation. Those locked rooms ultimately turn the mirror toward us, toward our relationship with knowledge and power, our tolerance for uncertainty and nuance, our capacity to absorb information that unsettles our most basic assumptions about ourselves and our world. And the keepers of these secrets are not only Vatican staff guarding restricted stacks. They are all of us, whenever we choose comforting assumptions over hard questions, institutional authority over independent inquiry, curated narratives over complicated realities. The secret archives are not confined to Rome. They reside in our own minds, in what we seek or avoid, in the questions we ask or refuse to ask. The dilemma facing the custodians of Vatican secrets may be the same one facing humanity at large. How do we balance the human need for stable beliefs with the moral duty to pursue truth? How do we protect social cohesion while acknowledging uncomfortable facts? How do we preserve the benefits of civilization while staying open to the possibility that some of our foundational assumptions may be wrong?